All right, good morning, everyone. And this morning we will be resuming the story of Joseph. We left off at the end of Genesis 41 with the famine being severe in all the earth. Now, today we're going to take a pretty big chunk. We're going to take 4 chapters. That's quite a bit, but we're not going to go through every particular verse, but I'm going to highlight things from these 4 chapters. This past week, I attended the Evangelical Theological Society conference. And basically, it was a bunch of people reading papers. It was not like hearing sermons. It was more like literally people reading papers. Some read them a little bit more passionately than others, and some did not. There were 600 sessions in 3 days. Obviously, I didn't go to all of them. I went to about 11 of them. Went to sessions on Hebrew grammar construction, the use of narrative gaps, listened to a series on the topic of gender as love, and a series of Asian American ministry topics. So it was a very broad range of presentations, and there was some dialoguing and interaction between groups of people on a particular topic. And so I have to say that because it was a very technical and academic scholarly sort of theme, it was hard. It was hard waking up in the morning and starting at 8:30 and listening to 4 straight sessions in a row. And I was trying really hard too. I would sit at the front row because it would force me to stay awake. At least I tried. But there were some really, really challenging, interesting issues. And one of them happened to be titled Joseph's Testings and the Use of Narrative Gaps in Genesis 42 to 44. Like, oh, well, I'm going to be preaching on that passage. So I thought that would be really good. And I'll be sharing actually quite a bit from that paper today. I was able to see a lot of friends from Master Seminary and Talbot, as well as pastor friends from the past. So it was actually a really enjoyable time. At the same time, I came back really just mentally drained. But I was also encouraged to see that there's so much more to keep learning. You know, sometimes when you read through the Bible, especially Old Testament narrative, you can just kind of treat it as a story and gloss over things and not realize that there are a lot of things there that we can learn, but we have to dig a little deeper. So if you remember in Genesis 37:2, the introduction to the story of Joseph is set in the context of Jacob, of whom we see the generations take place. So it's actually the story of the generations of Jacob with a particular focus on Joseph. But if you remember, when we first started this series, though we're looking at the life of Joseph, the main character is still God. God is the one who is providentially orchestrating through all the events that take place, and he is working out his purposes for good, even through the intentions and actions of evil men. Now, if you turn to Psalm 105, starting from verse 16, you'll see that the story of Joseph is shared in the context of praising God, worshiping God. And starting in verse 16 of Psalm 105, it says this, "And he called for a famine upon the land. He broke the whole staff of bread. He sent a man before them, Joseph, who was sold as a slave. They afflicted his feet with fetters. He himself was laid in irons until the time that his word came to pass. The word of Yahweh refined him. The king sent and released him. The ruler of people sent and set him free. He set him up as lord of his house and ruler over all his possessions, to imprison his princes at will, and that he might teach his elders wisdom. Then Israel came to Egypt, and Jacob sojourned in the land of Ham. And he caused his people to be very fruitful, and he caused them to be stronger than their adversaries." Now, if you remember, the book of Psalms is the hymn book of Israel. And oftentimes you'll see the stories of the patriarchs or others in the Old Testament era, and they would, especially here in Psalm 105, We see the story of Joseph set within the larger context of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, as God is recognized as keeping his covenant with them. So when the nation of Israel would come to worship God together, they would give thanks to him, they would call upon his name, they would make known his acts among the people. And so here we see that reciting of those acts. Go to verse 1 of Psalm 105, and you'll see that this is exactly what they're doing. Oh, give thanks to Yahweh, call upon his name, make known his acts among the peoples. Sing to him, sing praises to him, muse on all his wondrous deeds. Boast in his holy name. Let the heart of those who seek Yahweh be glad. Inquire of Yahweh in his strength. Seek his face continually. Remember his wondrous deeds which he has done, his miracles and the judgments uttered by his mouth. And we see that throughout the book of Psalms. There's this constant call to worship God. But here we see a particular focus on the patriarchs. Verse 6, O seed of Abraham, his servant, O sons of Jacob, his chosen ones. He is Yahweh our God. His judgments are in all the earth. He has remembered his covenant forever, the word which he commanded for 1,000 generations, which he cut with Abraham in his oath to Isaac. Then he confirmed it to Jacob for a statute, to Israel as an everlasting covenant, saying, to you I will give the land of Canaan as a portion of your inheritance. When there were only a few men in number, or little account, and sojourners in it, and they wandered about from nation to nation, from one kingdom to another people, he permitted no man to oppress them, and he reproved kings for their sakes. Do not touch my anointed ones until my prophets do no evil. Now, if you remember in the Old Testament, most of the folks didn't have a physical text to be able to read the truth. It was passed down to them primarily by oral tradition. And so when you read the Psalms, what the Psalms are doing is they're teaching God's people how to respond to God in light of the things that they have been told. So when they are told the stories of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph, it was to be in the context of worshiping and celebrating the greatness of God, the keeping of his covenant, his wonderful works, and that was meant to be passed from generation to generation. That's why you've often heard me share about Psalm 145, verse 4, where it says, one generation shall laud your works to another and shall declare your mighty deeds. In fact, if you read through the rest of Psalm 145, you'll see that it's very much in the same vein as Psalm 105. Now, one thing you might ask, are any of you Israelites? No, none of us are Israelites, at least that I know of. We are the category of Gentiles. Okay? But even the Gentiles were called to hear the greatness of God, to worship him, to celebrate his great deeds, and then to pass them on to the next generation as well. That's why we share these things. That's why when the children get together and they're learning the stories of the Bible, what we want them to see is not just a story. We want them to see the greatness of God. We want them to learn how to worship God as they see his character, as they see his great works. Now, of course, they need to be actually saved to fully grasp that, but we can still teach them and show them how great God is. Now, when we read the Genesis account, and again, it is a narrative account. Now, I know we have a few English literature majors. I know Caitlin is. Apart from the English literature majors, I don't know how many of us find literary devices very exciting. Do you even know what literary devices are? I just know they're books, and we try to read them, and there's different ways to understand genres and so forth. But maybe for those who understand the use of literary devices, can grasp some of the more nuanced things that are communicated when you read something. So when a narrative plays out, one question you need to ask is, okay, when I read a narrative, how am I supposed to respond? I mean, if it's just a story Is it actually relevant to me? Now, I think many of you know I love to read. I have a few books. I think close to 14,000 of them. And that wonderful team who's been cataloging them told me they're almost finished. I have to admit, though, when I took English literature at UCLA, I had no idea what the professor was talking about. I mean, it was the equivalent of just hearing wah, 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 wah. And that's it. I was like, what are they talking about? So as I introduce this theme of literary devices, I'm afraid some of you are going to tune out and just go wah, 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 because you're like, I don't get it. But if you could just sit on the edge of your seat a little bit and then open your eyes really big and try to consider. I'll be sharing, like I said, Paul Twist, who's a professor at the Master's Seminary, he gave this presentation, Joseph's Testing and the Use of Narrative Gaps in Genesis 42 through 44. He starts off with this. Narrative gaps are discontinuities in the plot, a deliberate withholding of information by the narrator necessary for the reader to make sense of the story. The biblical narrator often creates gaps, extending his reticent style to the point of omission at key junctures in the plot. Our analysis of narrative gaps typically amounts to an effort to close them. We consider what's missing, what clues we have to fill the void, and the implications of doing so. If I already lost you there, I'll try to explain it in a simple way. As you read Genesis, the story of Joseph, you might notice there are certain things not communicated, and it might bother you. Like, why is it not telling part of the story? That's the gap. But it's intentional. It's to force you as the reader to say, what's missing? And are there any clues to help me fill in that gap? And what are the implications of considering these gaps? So when you read through Genesis 42 to 45, you'll see that there are some questions that are raised. For instance, why does Joseph not reveal himself to his brothers immediately when he recognizes them? I mean, why does he draw it out so much longer than maybe he really needed to? Why does he accuse them of being spies? Why does he tell them to bring their youngest brother? And why is he testing them in this way? Now, we don't get the explanation. There's no explanation of the motives. There's no explanation of some sort of purpose behind it. But the narrative causes us to ask these questions. Paul Twist continues and says this. He considers the use of gaps in Genesis 42 to 44, specifically how Joseph's harsh treatment of his brothers contributes to the narrator's intent to shape the reader. Surveying briefly how the narrative creates a gap, attention is then given to its effect on the reader and how this works in according with the plot to instruct us. By neglecting to explain Joseph's motive for testing his family, the narrator invites us to think with the protagonist, who is Joseph. Standing in his place, we then receive Judah's speech directly in chapter 44. Like Joseph, we are challenged to show mercy and compassion to those who have done us harm and to proclaim the triumph of God's goodness over all. So in order to understand this, it means that there is this deliberate gap in the narrative where it is on purpose to appeal to behavioral norms and ethical standards, and the narrator's projections draw attention to these. His invitations asks us to articulate them. Now, when I read novels, and I do like historical fiction, and I just like fiction, there is even a category called Christian fiction. But sometimes when I read these stories, I get so drawn into them that you kind of become the character. I don't know if anyone else does that. I do. And I feel the emotions of the storyline, of the plot. In fact, there are times where I've just started crying because someone is tragically murdered. And then I start wondering, why am I crying? It's just a story. It's not even a real story. It's fiction. Those of you who maybe do such a thing, you'll understand. And some of you, you're like, I've never cried reading a book. In fact, I've only cried because I had to read a book. It's not really appealing in any way. But as we go through the story of Joseph, we see the main things that happen. Last time we looked at Joseph becoming the prime minister of Egypt. He is second only to Pharaoh, but otherwise has complete authority over all the land of Egypt. His plan to prepare for the years of famine is put in place. So he is able to save so much grain, not only for Egypt, but for even the surrounding countries. Now, up until chapter 42, we've pretty much just seen positive descriptions of Joseph. But now when we hit Genesis 42, and the brothers, 10 of the 11 brothers who are back with Jacob, they go to Egypt to purchase grain. Benjamin is left behind. And so this is where we pick up in Genesis 42. So point number one, what is this that God has done to us? And let's look at Genesis 42. And I'm going to read from verse 1. Now Jacob saw that there was grain in Egypt, and Jacob said to his sons, "Why are you staring at one another?" Then he said, "Behold, I've heard that there's grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some for us from there, so that we may live and not die." So 10 brothers of Joseph went down to buy grain from Egypt. But Jacob did not send Joseph's brother Benjamin with his brothers, for he said, lest any harm befall him. So the sons of Israel came to buy grain among those who were coming, for the famine was in the land of Canaan also. Now Joseph was the one in power over the land. He was the one who sold to all the people of the land. And Joseph's brothers came and bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. And Joseph saw his brothers and recognized them, but he disguised himself to them and spoke to them harshly. Okay, so that's the first point. You might say, why is he doing that? Why is he speaking to them harshly? Why did he disguise himself? Why is he withholding his identity? And he said to them, "Where have you come from?" And they said, "From the land of Canaan to buy food." But Joseph recognized his brothers, although they did not recognize him. And Joseph remembered the dreams which he had about them and said to them, "You are spies. You have come to look at the nakedness of the land." Then they said to him, "No, my lord, but your servants have come to buy food. We are all sons of one man. We are honest men. Your servants are not spies." Now, if you've been following the story, you would start to kind of look back and go, wait a second, what's going on here? I mean, first of all, why is Jacob harsh? But then it says, and Joseph remembered his dreams because his brothers bowed down with their faces to the ground, verse 6. Now, they don't recognize Joseph. Why? Because he's probably looking pretty Egyptian. He's got the Egyptian clothes. He's got the Egyptian hairstyle. He's got who knows what else Egyptian. But a lot of time has gone by. And they obviously don't recognize him because he was 17 when they last saw him. And so now this is about 22 years later. When they say in verse 11, "We are all sons of one man," that is a true statement. When they say that they're not spies, that is also a true statement. But when they say we are honest men, that is not true. They are not honest men. They've been living a lie for 22 years. They lied about Joseph to their father Jacob. They have been keeping that lie all the way up until now. And we'll see that that plays actually a pretty big role in what's going on. Verse 12, and he said to them, "No, but you have come to look at the nakedness of our land." So they said, "Your servants are 12 brothers in all, the sons of one man in the land of Canaan. Behold, the youngest is with our father today, and one is no more." And they don't realize they're talking to the one who is no more. And Joseph said to them, "It is as I said to you, you are spies. By this you will be tested. By the life of Pharaoh, you shall not go from this place unless your youngest brother comes here. Send one of you that he may get your brother, while you remain confined, that your words may be tested whether there is truth in you. But if not, by the life of Pharaoh, surely you are spies. Now, if you take a moment, did Joseph just come up with this right on the spot? I mean, was it like he all of a sudden was surprised to see his brothers? You see, we don't know. We don't have that information. One pastor who I was listening to a sermon said, well, since Joseph was the one who was selling the food, everyone would have had to come through him. And the famine was great in Canaan as well. So you wonder if Joseph already had planned for this encounter. Now, again, we don't know. But we know that something is taking place here. He's accusing them of being spies. Joseph knows that's not true. So why does he do it? Some have even accused Joseph here of being sinful, of being a liar. Is that what he's doing? Well, he's actually testing them. He's testing his brothers to see if they have changed. So then in verse 17, then he put them all together in prison for 3 days. And Joseph said to them on the third day, do this and live, for I fear God. Now, that should have given a clue to the brothers. But what was their problem? They didn't fear God. They had no fear of God. I mean, they hated their brother. They said they hated him even more, even more, even more. They were jealous of him. They were willing to kill him, murder him. Then they sold him into slavery. These are hardened, violent men. But now they're at the mercy of the one that they sold to Egypt. It's interesting in verse 19, Joseph says, if you are honest men, you say you are, if you are, then he changes the terms. Instead of letting only one go back to Canaan, he says, let one of your brothers be confined in your prison, but as for the rest of you, go bring grain for the famine of your households, and bring your youngest brother to me, so your words may be proven true, and you will not die. And they did so. Verse 21, then they said to one another, now this is a very interesting response to what they have just been told. They're not even responding directly to what Joseph has said. They said to one another, surely we are guilty concerning our brother, their brother Joseph, because we saw the distress of his soul when he begged us, yet we would not listen. Therefore, this distress has come upon us. And Reuben, the firstborn, answered, saying, did I not tell you, saying, do not sin against the boy, yet you would not listen? So also his blood, behold, it is required of us. Now they did not know that Joseph was listening, for there was an interpreter between them. We talked about how God, in his providence, orchestrates all things. Now, Joseph is using an interpreter, so the brothers really have no good reason to think it's Joseph. But Joseph can hear everything they're saying, and it must have broken his heart. So much so that he weeps. He turned away from them and wept. In fact, I don't know of any other biblical character that's described as having wept so much. And I like that about Joseph, because I'm a crier too. But you could tell that along the course of the story, even though he is, in a sense, presenting an alter ego, he can't help himself. His heart is so moved. And as he hears his brothers reliving their guilt, he weeps. Then he returned to them and spoke to them, and he took Simeon from them and bound him before their eyes. I mean, that had to be just an incredulous scenario. He takes Simeon. Why Simeon? Again, we don't know, but Simeon was one of the more violent ones He and Levi are the ones that murdered a whole village. He takes Simeon and he binds them deliberately before their eyes. He wants them to see Simeon bound. I mean, it really communicates something intense. Then Joseph gave a command to fill their bags with grain and to restore every man's money in his sack and to give them provisions for the journey. And thus it was done for them. So they loaded their donkeys with their grain and went from there. Then one of them opened his sack to give his donkey fodder at the lodging place. And he saw his money, and behold, it was in the mouth of his sack. So he said to his brothers, my money has been returned, and behold, it is even in my sack. And their hearts sank. And they turned trembling to one another, saying, what is this that God has done to us? Now, this is the first time we see the brothers mention God. But they're at a loss. Why? Because in seeing the money in the sack, they know that they can then be accused of stealing the money. They could be imprisoned. They could be put to death. Now, going back to this idea of the narrative gaps, Paul Twiss in his paper mentions this point. Up until this point, Joseph's character is stellar. He is a righteous man. He seeks to honor the Lord. He runs from sin when Potiphar's wife tries to seduce him. We don't see any signs of bitterness or resentment. He is truly exemplary. But mindful of this, we struggle to make sense of Joseph's response when his brothers stand before him pleading for help. Joseph saw his brothers and recognized them, but he treated them like strangers and spoke roughly to them. The exile's son could show them favor. He could make immediate plans to provide for them. He could ensure that the famine no longer threatens the family. Such a response would not only fit with his reputation of righteousness, it would allow for reunification with his father. Yet Joseph opts not to reveal his identity. He treated them harshly, accuses them falsely, detains them all. Then Simeon alone replaces their money as an ominous act of God and frames Benjamin to secure his servitude. Through the test, the narrator frequently draws attention to the brothers' distress, but he neglects to explain Joseph's behavior. We search for the reason behind his cruel treatment. Now, I'll have to admit, when I was reading through Genesis, you guys remember reading through Genesis early on in the year? How many of you just read the story? Did the first thought come to mind? Was it narrative gaps? I didn't think that. I'm just thinking, nice story of Joseph. And I'll be talking about this soon. But why is Joseph acting this way? One writer puts it, why does Joseph torment his brothers? Since this narrative gap forces a choice between inference and incoherence, no reader can afford to ignore it. Now, if you really care about what's going on, you're going to have to say, well, there's something else going on behind this, or there's something very incoherent about the story. Joseph is not supposed to be like this. It should bother you. Now, if it doesn't bother you, that's another problem. But if you're going, why is he doing this? Why is he treating his brothers in this way? Well, the narrator, the author, in this case, Moses, who wrote first 5 books of the Old Testament, he's actually writing with a purpose in mind. Now, according to various commentators, there are 4 options that readers have to consider in trying to close the narrative gap. First, Joseph's motivation is to punish his brothers for their previous wrongdoing, and that would make sense to some people. It's revenge, it's payback. I'm not saying that's what it actually was, but that's one of the options. Second, he intends to test his brothers to see if they have changed. And that seems true in this case. Joseph, third, wants to instruct them and so bring about some kind of transformation. So it's not only to test them, but it's hopefully to see that there will be change. And fourth, his goal is to manipulate the circumstances to bring about the fulfillment of his dreams. Early in Genesis 37. Now, Paul Twist explains that while each option is plausible, however, none prove decisive. In other words, these explanations are not enough. Now, I'll tell you, when I was listening to this paper, maybe there's a little bit more simple way to understand what the issue is. Again, it's to ask, why is certain information left out? And what is the intention of the narrator? Why is a gap inserted to the point where the plot becomes somewhat confusing? Well, Paul Twist again gives the answer. It is that we would begin to think like Joseph. You see, as you see the life of Joseph being displayed and you are wondering what's going on, what the narrator is trying to do is, well, try to think of it from Joseph's perspective. Step into his shoes. Consider why he might be doing these things. And consider everything that has been already given about his character, how he has handled all the trials and challenges. You'll see that the narrative will give clues about what has been left out. And the intention is to actually shape you as the reader to become more invested into the plot. Again, Paul Twist says this: perceived asymmetries demand our attention. If something is asymmetrical, okay, like those of you who do, I don't know, if you look at some sort of like drawing and it doesn't look balanced and it bothers you, that's kind of the idea. Asymmetries should bother you. When our reading is active and not passive, we form associations with the narrator and acquiesce to his worldview. In this way, the narrator's bids for our involvement serve his purpose to shape us. Now, I've read this paper several times, so I'm quoting all these things. Like, oh, this is a lot to think about. It's just a story. But how many of us actually read actively? Especially when you get through those rough portions of the Old Testament. I mean, how many of you died in Leviticus and died again in Numbers and then died again in Deuteronomy? I mean, you keep dying, just because it's so hard. But we have to read actively. And even the narrative portions, which are relatively easier to read compared to other sections, you can't just simply gloss over superficially. You have to ask, what are we being challenged to think? Now, Paul Twist in his presentation points to several features of the narrative that support such a reading. He says, first, note the permanent nature of the gap. The gap in this account is such that it prompts maximum associating between the reader and the protagonist. The former, the reader, must unreservedly enter into the thoughts of the latter for success in the acts of reading. So in order for you to really understand where this is going, you're being forced almost to become Joseph. Think like Joseph. Secondly, we observe the relationship of Joseph's testing to the past. And this is a really interesting perspective. The exiled son engineers a series of scenarios that form correspondence with previous events. His accusations that the fathers are spying the nakedness of the land parallels the charges brought against Joseph by Potiphar's wife. Their time of incarceration replicates the protagonist's time in prison. The detaining of Simeon represents the scenario of Joseph in the pit. In other words, there are certain connections that seem to be related to Joseph's past. And maybe that's why he is doing things a certain way that reflects what he's experienced. Third, we can note the unusualness of Joseph's behavior relative to the rest of the narrative. Whereas previously the protagonist, Joseph, demonstrated virtue and leadership, the testing of his brothers portrays something of an alter ego or character inversion. As the narrator presents the protagonist in a manner that runs contrary to expectations, our response is again one of stimulation, whereby we strain to understand the shift. Observation becomes participation as we sympathize with the protagonist in order to understand him. And I hope you're following this. It's a little bit of a more challenging way to read the text. And then fourthly, Joseph's emotional outbursts throughout the text contribute to the intended effect of the gap. By drawing attention to certain sentiments, we begin to feel as the protagonist feels. Over time, we form an empathetic relationship. So Joseph's emotions further secure our involvement and ask that we see the world from the same perspective. Now, again, go back to Genesis 42:11. When the brothers say, "We are all sons of one man, we are honest men, your servants are not spies." Imagine Joseph hearing them say that. We are honest men. He is the victim of all their evil. And he is also the victim of their dishonesty. Now, as they go on, he binds Joseph. So 9 brothers go back to Egypt. And as one of them opens the sack to feed his donkey, he sees the money in the mouth of his sack. Now, again, as I mentioned, this is the first time we hear the brothers mention God, but it's only out of guilt. But this guilt is not just about the immediate scenario, it's about what they had done to Joseph. There is now the harsh reality that another brother is gone. And they have been given the impossible task of bringing back Benjamin when they know very well their father will never let him go. Or at least that's what they think. But in a sense, this is the first honest moment that they display. So when they get back to Canaan and they see Jacob and they tell him what happened, here's Jacob's response: "You have bereaved me of my children. Joseph is no more, Simeon is no more, and you would take Benjamin. All these things against me." So understandably, Jacob, of course, has absolutely no desire to let Benjamin go. But all he sees is everything is against him. Now, Reuben, who is the firstborn, anyone firstborn here? A few of you, okay? Firstborn are supposed to be responsible, right? They're supposed to have good solutions to problems. So here's Reuben, the firstborn's response. He's the firstborn. Unfortunately, he had forfeited the firstborn status by sleeping with Bilhah, Jacob's wife. He gives this response in 42, verse 37. Then Reuben spoke to his father, saying, "You may put my 2 sons to death if I do not bring him back to you. Put him in my hand, and I will return him to you." Now, if you're reading that, I don't know, when I read that, I think, what in the world is that? Why would you tell your father, "You can kill your 2 grandsons if I don't bring back Benjamin"? I mean, what would that accomplish? I mean, we understand kind of he's trying to lend some gravity and saying, "Well, I'm pretty serious, Dad. You can kill my 2 sons if I don't bring them back." Now, what grandfather would want his grandsons to be put to death? I mean, when you put yourself in the scene, I think of, I have 2 grandsons. Benjamin, interestingly enough, and JJ. How in the world is that a solution? You see, that should outrage you. You should say, never, never such a solution should ever be considered. How could you? And I titled each of these points with God being central, because there are statements made in each of the chapters that show God is central. Time goes by, Jacob's family runs out of grain. So Jacob tells his sons, can you go and buy a little food? But now, instead of Reuben, Judah becomes the spokesman. He speaks up. Jacob still obviously does not want to send Benjamin, but Judah makes it clear, unless you send Benjamin, we will not go. We are not going to go get the food because we were told explicitly, if you do not bring your youngest brother, I will not see you. Now, if you remember Genesis 38 and the interlude story of Judah, he marries a Canaanite. He has two evil sons that God puts to death. He gets his own daughter-in-law pregnant, Tamar. But something has changed about Judah over time. He takes leadership. He offers to take full responsibility. In chapter 43, verse 9, he tells Jacob, I myself will be the guarantee for him. From my hand you may require him. If I do not bring him back to you and set him before you, then I shall bear the sin before you all my days. You see, that's what Reuben should have said. I will take responsibility. But no, he's like, put my two sons to death. Judah evidently has matured and grown and learned. So Jacob then tells his sons to take Benjamin, get some gifts, get the best of the land of Canaan, double the money, bring it there. And he asks that God Almighty would grant them compassion before the man. It's interesting that he's praying, God, show compassion to my sons before this man that he doesn't know is Joseph. So when they arrive in Egypt, Joseph invites his brothers into his home. He prepares a feast for them. The brothers are worried that they'll get in trouble, so they immediately tell the house steward, hey, we had money in our sacks. We brought that money back. We want you to know that we didn't want to steal anything. They were scared that they would be taken as slaves and their donkeys would be taken from them. But here's the response of the house steward in chapter 43, verse 23. And he said, do not be afraid. Your God and the God of your father has given you treasure in your sacks. Your money has come to me. Then he brought Simeon out to them. Now, I always like to picture these kind of scenes that are portrayed in scripture. You can only imagine. When Simeon is brought out to him, they see he's alive and he's restored. It must have been such an emotional reunion. Joseph then gets home, meets his brothers, they present their gift, and it says again, they bowed to the ground before him. They bowed to him quite a few times. And you have to think, Joseph's like, my dream has come true over and over and over again. They keep bowing down. Now, after asking about their father, and they say that Jacob is well and alive, the brothers bow down again, prostrate themselves before Joseph. Then Joseph saw Benjamin after not having seen him for 22 years. Imagine what's going on in Joseph's heart. This is his dear brother. S. Lewis Johnson calls him his uterine brother. They came from the same uterus, because I remember there are 4 moms involved with the brothers of Joseph. And he tells Benjamin, may God be gracious to you, my son. And he hurried out of the room and was deeply stirred with compassion for Benjamin, and he wept in his chamber. He then washed his face, came back out, had the meal start, and he had his brothers seated in their birth order. They were looking at each other in astonishment. He gave portions from his own table, but he gave Benjamin 5 times greater a portion than his other brothers. Okay, now we have AYCE, right? Korean barbecue, all you can eat. Korean barbecue. They didn't have all you can eat back then. I mean, you just got your portion and that's it. But remember, these are Hebrews from Canaan who are despised by the Egyptians, and they get to sit at the table of the prime minister, and they're given food from his table. But Benjamin receives 5 portions. That's a test. Now, if you were sitting at the table and if you were not Benjamin, what would your first thought most likely be? Why does he get 5 portions? I mean, how come we get 1 portion and he gets 5? I think if we're honest, we'd all think that. We just kind of give the side eye. Look, why does he get so much food? But it's a test. Joseph wants to see how they're going to treat Benjamin. He's wondering if they're going to be jealous, envious, for being given favored treatment. Remember? Because what did Joseph get? He got the fancy coat, whatever it was. It was something that the brothers didn't get. That's why they hated him for it. But in chapter 43, verse 34, it says, so they feasted and drank freely with him. So evidently things got pretty comfortable. They're talking, they're eating. Maybe they're even joking around a little bit. And in chapter 44, this is the final stage of Joseph's testing. And this is where we see that the guilt that they have been living with is acknowledged. God has found out the iniquity of your servants. Now, after feasting his brothers, Joseph tells his house steward to fill their bags with grain, put the money back again, but in Benjamin's sack, the youngest, put his silver cup. So you can imagine as they are leaving the city, they must have been pretty happy. We got Simeon back. We didn't have to lose Benjamin. We got to have a feast. We got the grain. We got food to take back home. All is well. But as they head out of the city, the house steward is instructed by Joseph to go after them and confront them of stealing the silver divinity cup. So when the house steward catches up with them, says, why would you take his cup? In verse 7 of chapter 44, the brother said to him, why does my Lord speak such words as these? Far be it from your servants to do such a thing. Behold, the money which we found in the mouth of our sacks we have brought back to you from the land of Canaan. How then could we steal silver or gold from your Lord's house? With whomever of your servants it is found, let him die, and we also will be my Lord's slaves. They sound pretty confident that they had nothing to do with it. So the steward says, well, no, I'm just going to take the one who has a silver cup as a slave. The rest of you can go your way. You're innocent. So he starts with the oldest, and he goes through each of their sacks. And you can imagine as they again see their money, they see money in the sacks. You would think that should give them maybe another clue, something's going on, but we don't know. Again, we don't see it given the information. But then Benjamin's is the last sack, and the cup is found. And it says the brother tore their clothes, loaded their donkeys, and returned to the city. Now, if you remember the first trip, when they found money in the sack, what did they do? They said, what has God done to us? But they continued on back home. They left Simeon behind, and they're like, okay, well, we're just going to keep moving on. But this time they go back. Mentions that Judah and his brothers come to Joseph's house, and they fall to the ground before him again. As Joseph asks them why they have done this deed of taking a silver cup, Judah is the one who responds. And it's very telling how his response is framed. Look at Genesis 44:16. It says, so Judah said, what can we say to my Lord? What can we speak, and how can we justify ourselves? Doesn't respond at all, even though it's not true. They didn't take the cup. God has found out the iniquity of your servants. Behold, we are my Lord's slaves, both we and the one in whose possession the cup has been found. Again, earlier in Genesis 42:28, the brothers had asked the question, what is this that God has done to us? It is clear now what God has done. Their guilt has been exposed. Their sins against Joseph have been acknowledged. Now, it's sad that they have yet to tell Joseph directly these things, but Joseph still is able to hear their hearts being exposed as he tests them. So in Genesis 44, verses 18 to 34, Judah gives an appeal to Joseph. And this is really where we see something truly has changed about Judah. Then Judah came near to him, verse 18, and said, "O my Lord, may your servant please speak a word in my Lord's ears. And do not be angry with your servant, for you are equal to Pharaoh." My Lord asked his servant, saying, "Have you a father or brother?" And we said to my Lord, "We have an old father, and a little child of his old age. Now his brother is dead, so he alone is left of his mother, and his father loves him. Then you said to your servants, Bring him down to me, that I may set my eyes on him. And we said to my Lord, The boy cannot leave his father. If he should leave his father would die. You said to your servants, however, if your youngest brother does not come down with you, you will not see my face again. Thus it happened that when we went up to your servant, my father, we told him the words of my Lord. And our father said, Go back, buy us a little food. But we said, We cannot go down. If our youngest brother is with us, then we will go down, for we cannot see the man's face if our younger brother is not with us. And your servant, my father, said to us, You know that my wife bore me 2 sons, and the one went out from me. And I said, Surely he is torn to pieces, and I have not seen him since. If you take this one also from me, and harm befalls him, you will bring my gray hair down to Sheol and evil. So now when I come to your servant, my father, and the boy is not with us, and his life is bound up in the boy's life, so it will be that when he sees that the boy is not with us, he will die. Thus your servants will bring the gray hair of your servant, our father, down to Sheol and sorrow. For your servant became a guarantee for the boy to my father, saying, If I do not bring him back to you, then I shall bear the sin before my father all my days. So now, please let your servant remain instead of the boy as a slave to my Lord, and let the boy go up with his brothers. For how shall I go up to my father if the boy is not with me, lest I see the evil that would overtake my father? If you are Joseph, how do you take that? You are hearing the words of your father being repeated through Judah. Paul Twist writes, Judah's speech also transcends his original audience. His pleas with Joseph to show mercy confront both the protagonist and us. The logic of the narrative would suggest this, as the narrator opened a gap concerning Joseph's motive and prompted us to stand in his place. We cannot avoid receiving Judah's speech directly. Moreover, this is the ordinary outwork of any plot. It functions as the mediating pivot from the narrative world to our own. The ordering of affairs within the story exerts a force on the way we live. The point is especially true when we find in the narrative universal principles that are not limited to the specific circumstances of the story. Judah's pleas with Joseph to show compassion readily confronts us. So the point of application is very clear. How would we respond if we were Joseph? Would the plea of Judah move us to compassion? Or would we respond with cold-hearted indifference, judgment, retribution? So we look at Joseph now in the narrative. How will he respond? Will he show compassion? Will he show mercy? Will he continue to test his brothers? Will we see his response in Genesis 45? It is at this point Joseph can no longer restrain himself. Verse 1. Joseph could not restrain himself before all those who stood by him, and he called out, Have everyone go out from me. So there was no man with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. Then he wept loudly, and the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it. Then Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still alive? But his brothers could not answer him, for they were terrified at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, please come near to me. And they came near, and he said, I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt. So now do not be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there's still 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. So God sent me before you to establish for you a remnant in the earth and to keep you alive for a great remnant of survivors. So now it was not you who sent me here, but God. And he has set me as a father to Pharaoh and lord of all the house, his household, and ruler over all the land of Egypt. Paul Twist writes, Judah's speech to Joseph is a rhetorical tour de force that proves overwhelming for the Egyptian lord. Judah's words bring the test to an end as Joseph makes his identity known, assures his brother of his forgiveness, and promises to provide for them in the land. You can only imagine Joseph's heart as for 22 years he has been carrying the weight of all the hurt and pain that his brothers had inflicted on him. And the main thing he is wanting to know, have they changed? Have they changed? Or are they the same? Would they do the same to Benjamin as they had done to him? Would they be willing to let him become a slave just like they sold Joseph into slavery? Would they abandon Benjamin just as they had abandoned him? Would they hate Benjamin and be jealous of his status as they had been of him? Judah's appeal answers all those questions. So then Joseph reveals himself. He weeps so loudly, everyone can. You see, the brothers are terrified, it says there. They're dismayed because they did not anticipate this. How could they? For all they knew, Joseph was dead. They had no news of him. But to hear his voice, to see his face, to know that he is not only alive, but he is ruler over Egypt, that has just to be, it's just too much to handle. But what Joseph tells them reassures us about why he did what he did. He always knew something, and it was this: God sent him for a purpose. 3 times he says, God sent me. Verse 5, for God sent me before you to preserve life. Verse 7, so God sent me before you to establish for you a remnant in the earth and to keep you alive. Verse 8, so no, it was not you who sent me here, but God. And then in verse 9, Joseph tells them, hurry and go up to my father. Say to him, thus says your son Joseph, God has set me as Lord of all Egypt. Come down to me. Do not delay. Joseph understood very clearly why he was in Egypt. It wasn't because of his brothers. Imagine them hearing this. For all they knew, it was absolutely because of them, their hatred, their jealousy. They sold him into slavery. They said, at least we won't have his blood on our hands. But they did want to kill him. But Joseph knew, and we see this reflected later in Genesis 50, verse 20, and we'll get there in a few weeks. God was working out his good purposes even through their evil. This must have been such a monumental moment for Joseph after 22 years to be reconciled, and his heart is full of compassion and forgiveness. It says he first fell on his brother Benjamin's neck and wept. Then he kissed all his brothers and wept on them. You know, there's something very precious about reconciliation. Now you can imagine Pharaoh hears about all this, and this is grace and mercy shown to the brothers. He tells Joseph, bring your father, bring your whole family. We will give them the best of the land, and we'll take care of them. So Joseph gives his brothers supplies. He gives them wagons. Back then, the Israelites had no wagons. They just had donkeys. So you can imagine how limited that was for them. We'll see this next time when Jacob sees the wagons. It's as if he saw like a limo. He never saw one before. And it's bearing food and gifts. And that's why he has to believe, okay, it must be Joseph, because there's no other way this could happen. But I still just really look at that scene of restoration. Now, what's interesting is the brothers still never say anything directly to Joseph about acknowledging their guilt, confessing their sin, and asking for forgiveness. They still don't. But Joseph forgives. Joseph shows compassion to them. We'll see that later in Genesis 50 when there's closure. Now, as you think about this scene, I am sure that you have those that you are not reconciled with, especially maybe family. It's so painful when families are not reconciled. There are other relationships, church relationships, friendships. You know, there are those with whom I am not reconciled. And even to this day, they cause such pain and such anguish. You know, the strain of conflict, it takes such toll on people. I mean, over the years, my body has just fallen apart. My heart's been crushed. And there are times when I think about it a little too much, I get pretty discouraged. And you see how it can easily lead to bitterness and resentment. But there's one thing that I am always reminded that does keep me going. The same God who accomplished good in the life of Joseph, even through the evil motives, thoughts, speech, and deeds of people, he's still the same God who works out good. God never makes mistakes. God does not leave room for accidents. We have the great promise of Romans 8:28. For God causes all things to work together for good for those who love him and are called according to his purpose. One day, we hope there will be reconciliation, restoration for all these broken relationships. But until that day, it can still be hard. And that's why we look at the life of Joseph. And we think, how does someone who has gone through so much pain and anguish and has every opportunity for vengeance, for retribution, and yet he shows compassion and mercy? I just can't help but, be so challenged by that. I can't imagine being there as Joseph, hearing Judah humble himself, saying, I know you are next to Pharaoh. Please show mercy and hear me out. And he hears Judah say, I'm willing to sacrifice my life. And he foreshadows the very one who will come from the tribe of Judah, Jesus, the Lion of the tribe of Judah. There's so many things here that should really cause you to just be in wonder of how God operates. Now, the story isn't done yet. We're just at chapter 45. There are 5 more chapters. It's interesting. Joseph sends off his brothers, and he tells them, do not quarrel on your way. I just think that's so funny. After all of this, it's so dramatic. It's so amazing. And he sends them back with everything. Hey, don't quarrel. Why? Because he could imagine them, if they start getting caught up to it, they're saying, I told you, you shouldn't have done this. Why did you do this? Like, they could relive the whole thing. It's like, no, just don't quarrel. Go get father, get the family, bring them all back. Joseph loved his father. He can't wait to see him. I often wonder, why didn't Joseph just go himself? Well, again, we don't know. But we see how the story unfolds. And there is purpose in it.